Hello, friends, and welcome to the March 30th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about policy issues here in our great state and have a conversation about how you can engage in that process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness. We have an exciting episode for you today as we welcome Dick Lavine to the program. Dick is the Senior Fiscal Analyst with Every Texan and one of Weekly Witness's go-to guests to discuss the state budget. And we'll also welcome one of Dick's biggest fans, our Executive Director, Bee Moorhead, who will talk about what faith communities should focus on in the state budget process. On this week's Watchlist, Josh talks women's basketball with some thoughts on the importance of the May runoff elections. And kick us off, we'll begin with a weekly word from Rabbi Neil Blumofe. But before we get to the program, I want to share a couple of quick thoughts at the top. First, thanks as always to all who've reached out with comments, questions, and suggestions for the podcast. We'd love to hear from you. I'll be looking for your emails at scott@texasimpact.org. And help us out by subscribing, sharing, and inviting a friend to listen. And also, first, an apology and correction from last week's episode. During the weekly word, it was mentioned that hostages were killed at the Colleyville Synagogue. That was a mistake, as the congregation's members all made it out safe. I apologize that we did not catch that before posting. As for today's episode, as Dick and B will clarify, it might feel like a slow news day at the Capitol, but behind the scenes, lawmakers are gearing up for the next budget and legislative cycle, so it's important that we gear up too. Also, primary runoff elections are coming up soon, and we all need to be checking to see what races will be on our ballots. Remember, you can vote in the runoff election that corresponds with the primary you voted in March. If you didn't vote in the March primary, first, we need to talk, but second, you can choose either primary in the runoff. And now is the perfect time to begin relationship building meetings with representatives and candidates, including those you didn't vote for. We hope each week's episode of Weekly Witness gives you new insights, talking points, and points of attachment for conversations with policy leaders and their staffs. So with that, here we go. The Weekly Word with Rabbi Neil Blumofe.
My name is Rabbi Neil Blumofe, Senior Rabbi of Congregation Agudas Achim in Austin, Texas. When we look at the weather forecast in Texas, more and more we see with unsure eyes. We regularly experience the extreme highs and lows of fluctuating temperature, and many of us have not recovered our confidence in the reliability of the Texas energy grid. Who prioritizes the safety of ordinary Texans? Can we rely on our elected officials to put the real, everyday needs of citizens above other priorities? Can we design and find a system that is not partisan, but rather is moral, responsive, and even visionary? Beginning with strategic infrastructure spending and regulation, we can yet weather these storms. We celebrate the blessings of Texas. Our state is the largest producer of electricity from wind power in the United States, and we are also the largest producer of oil and gas in this country. Much like the children of Israel when building the tabernacle, we have the blessings of abundance, more than enough for all of us. We have much to choose from and many resources to manage as we provide for the residents of our great state and bolster our economy also by increasing our export markets. We are ably blessed. How do we manage our resources responsibly? How do we see that this world is shifting as our climate intensifies? Our land bears the weight of our choices made from generation to generation. We realize in our day that we must work together to keep each other safe, warm in winter and cool in the summer. We must adjust to our changing world and recognize, too, that our weather is getting more furious more often. We must be strategic with the good fortune of our state and not just reward those who have ownership claims to natural resources. Now is the time for our thinking beyond routine. We can harness creativity and make sure that the blessings of Texas benefit those living in our state. This means that we shouldn't have to worry about a grid that is unstable or that we will be without the energy that we need in the most critical time when we need it. How we respond to each other in times of crisis is our definition of whether or not we are in community together. Do we truly care for our neighbor? For example, can we prioritize free wireless internet across our Lone Star state for protection? Can there not be positive incentives created that increase consumer side efficiency and conservation? Can we not lead with caring? Our Psalms state, "The earth is the Lord's and its fullness, the inhabited land and those who dwell in it." We are, all of us, just passing through this life with limited days. We are to develop a sense of well-being that goes beyond our own sense of being. We are to connect to our ancestors and those who have lived before us in this state and learn their useful, powerful, and sustainable lessons, as well as we must set the table for the generations that will come after us, bestowing upon them the legacy of the choices that we make today. Our faith traditions are to give us depth and perspective. We are living in the eyesight of God, not in our personal clamor and material claims of the moment. Our lives are precious, timeless, and they exist past the arc of our consumption. We are on this earth to take care of each other, to be good stewards of our state, as if we were tending the Garden of Eden itself, building a tabernacle with the abundance of our resource. Let us be driven to provide for each of us and for all of us with the riches we possess. Let us be smart and avoid another exile into the harshest wilderness, unprotected. Let us define the costs of environmental change in Texas, and then let us plan for those costs as we strive to not be haughty, but holy. In all kinds of weather, we are to take care of each other. Let us not be afraid to pivot and adapt new opportunities. This is how we respond with grace. We share what we have not only for our survival, but in ably and conscientiously magnifying the name of Texas, which is blessed with so much. We can thus lead with courage and with vision in our nation and in our world as we are responsible and caring for each other.
This week's episode of Weekly Witness was brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas and the COVID Collaborative.
Joining us for today's conversation is Every Texan's Dick Lavine, where he serves as the senior fiscal analyst. We're going to talk about the state budget today, but Dick, it's so good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks. I'm always happy to help out with Weekly Witness.
I've missed seeing your face, so it's good to see you today. I've definitely missed you over the course of the pandemic. But before we get to the revenue forecast and planning for the 2023 Texas Legislature, I wonder if you can talk to us about some of the property tax issues that are on the May 1st ballot.
Yeah, actually, it's May 7th, and it's a Saturday election, which is a little odd because it's only just 2 constitutional amendments, which means these are things that pass the legislature by more than a 2/3 vote. But they don't take effect until they're approved at a statewide referendum. They both involve property taxes, and in a way, they both reveal some of the shortcomings of our current system. I believe it's on the ballot second, but I'll talk about it first because it's the easiest to understand. which is it would raise the homestead exemption from school property taxes from the current $25,000 to $40,000. What a homestead exemption does, it reduces the taxable value of your home. So let's say your home is worth $500,000. If you have a $25,000 homestead exemption, then you would be paying taxes on 500 minus 25, $475,000. And if this passes, you would instead be paying taxes on 500 minus 40, or $460,000. And as we know, a lot of people are feeling very pressed by property taxes. I'm sure this thing is going to pass. We do not think that cutting property taxes should be top priority. We need more money for our schools, and I'm sure you've been reading about the problems schools are having keeping their teachers. So giving away school property taxes would not be our priority. But if you're going to do it, a flat dollar homestead exemption is the best way to do it. And the reason is the claims from the sponsors are that this $15,000 increase in the homestead exemption would reduce your property taxes by about $175 because of what the average tax rate is across the state. Well, that's $175 for somebody with a $300,000 home, and it's $175 for somebody with a $3 million home. So it's obviously worth a lot more to people who it's not necessarily the lowest income people, because you have to be a homeowner to be able to take advantage of it, but those people who are probably lower income and have lower value homes get proportionately, compared to their income, a much bigger break from this. So we have a terribly regressive tax system, takes a much higher proportion of the incomes of low and middle income families than it does of higher income families. So even this tiny shift toward giving the bigger break to the people who need it the most is the way to go if you're cutting property taxes.
Right.
Now, this other proposition is very complicated if you read it, but it's not that hard to understand. There is a break in the school property tax system for people who are over 65 or disabled, commonly called the over 65 freeze. And it's not literally a freeze, but it puts a cap on what your school property taxes are. So, for instance, when I turned 65, the tax bill for me in that year was frozen. If the value of my home goes up, and it certainly has, or if the tax rate for the school district goes up, it does not change my tax bill. It's still the tax bill for the year in which I turned 65. Well, since then, in my case, there have been school finance bills that have passed that have forced down school property tax rates. I'm still paying the same amount I paid when it froze. So what this amendment would do is lower that frozen amount by the same proportion as everybody else who's not over 65 or disabled got in terms of a tax break because of lower tax rates. So again, I don't think giving homestead exemptions based on age is the proper way to do it. I'm still working full time. I can pay my taxes just as well now as the year in which I turned 65. A better way to do it is according to your ability to pay. So the people who are getting really squeezed by property taxes as a proportion of their income get the break. There's a system called circuit breakers that are commonly used in a lot of states. And it's like an electric circuit breaker. When there's a surge in voltage, it cuts off the electricity to your home before it can start a fire. Circuit breaker works the same way. When property taxes exceed a certain proportion of your income, it buffers it, doesn't cut it off necessarily, but it slows it down to help protect you from having your income eaten up with property taxes. That would be the better way to do it. The way Texas does it is it's linked to age. But as long as we have that system, it's only fair that people over 65 or who are disabled get the same tax break everybody else does.
Right. So changing subjects a little bit, that's really helpful, Dick, because I certainly, I pay attention, I feel like a decent amount to these things, and I had not been paying attention to those on the May ballot. So that's helpful for our listeners. I appreciate it. So I know there's a lot going on in the world right now, and listeners are really going to care about the Texas legislature starting in January 2023, but the work is going on now to prepare for that, right? And so I wonder if you can help us understand the budgeting process, because they're not going to show up in January 2023 and begin that process. That's starting now. So how's that process work? Where are we in the process, and how's that going to move as we go throughout this year into 2023?
Well, as I'm sure you know, Texas has, the legislature meets only every 2 years, and they write a budget for 2 years. So we're still in the budget that they wrote when they adjourned when the regular session adjourned in May last year. And that budget's going to keep going until a year and a half from now, literally. So we're still in that budget. But yes, you're right. They're already thinking about the next budget. And we have on our website what we call a budget cycle. It's a very handy diagram showing how these things work. And I'm hoping you can put the link to it in the show notes.
We can absolutely do that. Find it there.
But what it shows is at this period, from January to June, is when the agencies start to work. The Legislative Budget Board and the Governor's Budget Office tell all the state agencies how much money they can ask for. And usually, unfortunately, it's based on what they had last time, without regard to caseload growth or enrollment growth, or, especially nowadays, inflation. But we haven't gotten those budget instructions yet. They're going to be coming up soon, probably in the next month. Then the agencies get to work and they start putting together their budget requests. It's called the Legislative Appropriation Request, or LAR. And they do a lot of that internally, although there is some opportunity, if you can, to make known to these agencies how circumstances have changed and how there are important things that they hadn't funded in the past that they should really ask for in the future. But then there are actually public hearings. And these hearings are not actually legislative hearings. They're hearings from the LBB staff and the governor's budget staff. But they're public, and the agency lays out its initial requests, and then the public can respond about where the agency is wasting money, where the agency could do better by devoting more resources. So that's the first opportunity, and that takes place in the fall, usually August, September, October. Then in November, there's an important and often overlooked step, which is we have a constitutional limit on spending in this state. It's been in place for a long time. And the way it works is the Legislative Budget Board, which is 5 members of the House, 5 members of the Senate, comes together and they set what this limit is. And then the legislature cannot approve a budget that goes past that limit without a very difficult to get supermajority vote. Until recently, it was linked to the growth in personal income. And the Legislative Budget Board would come in and they'd have estimates from the controller and from certain economic advisors what the growth in income would be, and they set the cap, and they do not go over that cap. Last session, a bill passed that really changes and makes much more restrictive what the spending limit is. The limit used to apply only to tax revenue, undedicated tax revenue. It now applies to what they now call consolidated general revenue, which is all general revenue and dedicated general revenue, all sorts of different sort of subcategories, but it's a much broader brush. And instead of growth in personal income, it's linked to projected growth in population and inflation, which very likely is going to be lower. So they've made this limit much tighter and affecting much more of the budget. So even if they have a ton of money, and I think we'll be talking about that, if they wanted to, they couldn't spend it anyway without a supermajority vote. Now, inflation, it may turn out to be a lot higher than they expected, so this limit may not be as tight as they were hoping, and the budget that's coming up in the next legislature will be the first budget affected by this. But over time, it's definitely going to slow the ability of the legislature to address needs. Or in the words of the people who propose these things, shrinking government. As if government were a bad thing.
So speaking of a ton of money, I remember sessions where, it seemed like there wasn't near enough, which is maybe most sessions, but we've been hearing about a possible $25 billion surplus for the next biennium. Where'd that number come from, and are you buying it?
Well, the number showed up in the fall, last fall, and it was really a difference between the original biennial revenue estimate the controller makes in January, usually literally the day before the legislature meets. And it's his estimate of how much money is going to be coming in from taxes and federal funds and land sales and fees, hospital admissions, whatever that comes into the state coffers. And it's another limit on how high the budget can go. They can't spend more money than they're going to get. Well, the controller makes a supplemental estimate in the fall called the certification estimate, where he certifies that the budget that the legislature has passed can be paid for within available revenue. Well, things changed a lot between January of 2021 and October of 2021. We got a flood of federal money. Oil prices were, much higher now, but even then were much stronger than had been expected. And of course, the legislature left a lot of money on the table. So one way or the other, the difference between what he had said was going to be available in January and the amount that's available, according to him, as of October is $25 billion. Plus, in the 6 months since then, we've been growing even faster. And let me just give you an example. This is from the certification estimate for general revenue-related money, so not including federal funds and things like that. For the sales tax, which is nearly 2/3 of all state tax revenue, the estimated growth from one year to the next was 7.5%. Well, so far in this fiscal year, which is halfway done, it's 23%.
Wow.
Growing much faster than expected. The stimulus checks went out. Unemployment is low. Things are really popping for the sales tax. And we could bring in maybe $5 billion, even more than was expected in that October certification estimate. So the money is just flooding in. So there is plenty available to fund our needs if they want to. Partly they have their self-imposed spending limit that they just made much tighter. And the other is their ideology, which is against providing for people's needs and making investments in the future, but rather redirecting it all to tax cuts. In fact, during the interim between legislative sessions, the committees do studies. They look back on what they passed and how they're being implemented, and sometimes they look forward to things that they want to enact in the next session, which is good because, a 5-month session is not, you can't start from scratch in January. You got to have done your work beforehand, and advocates know that too. You don't wait till they show up. You got to get to work before then. Well, the Ways and Means Committee is having a hearing on April 21st to go through some of their interim charges, as they're called. And I'll just read one of them. And they'll be taking public testimony on this if anybody would like to go and testify. And also, let me just say, they instituted something during the pandemic that is still going to be in effect, which is you can post comments. Even if, I don't think they're taking remote testimony, but even if you can't make it to Austin or you can't make it to the Capitol at that time, you can go on the House website, search for the committee, search for the hearing, and post a comment, which becomes part of the public record. And you can say what you would have said if you'd been able to testify in person. The issue I'm concerned about, and I'll just read it straightforwardly, study and consider methods of providing additional property tax relief, including the use of $3 billion in available American Rescue Plan Act funds that were held for future tax relief by the 87th legislature and other sources of revenue. explore options to reduce business property tax burdens and options for limiting the growth of property tax bills. So there you are. There is $3 billion sent by the federal government to Texas under the rescue plan. The legislature did not spend it last session, and instead they set it aside not to help with teacher retention and making up for the fact that kids fell behind because they couldn't go to school in person, but rather to cut taxes. And the first tax they mention is reducing business property taxes. So they're not even talking about looking out for homeowners, to say nothing of renters. They're looking to reward business with the $3 billion in federal money that they got and didn't spend. I'm a little astonished that they're so straightforward about it.
Right.
Because it seems to me just a blatant statement of whose interests they favor.
Yeah, that is interesting. And you've mentioned a couple of times this prioritization of tax cuts, especially for businesses. You've talked about the budgeting process and how all of this work goes into preparing. The one thing I'd like to ask you about in terms of the budget from last time is it seemed like 15 minutes or so after, slight hyperbole, but soon after Sine Die, soon after they left, there was an announcement that a lot of the funds in the budget they just approved were going to be going towards this Operation Lone Star, which is the governor's efforts at the border. So you want to say a word about that and how that's impacting the state budget?
Well, that, in fact, is $3 billion there, too. Just the same amount of money we were just talking about. And it has no discernible purpose. There have been some good articles in the Texas Tribune that they've done jointly with ProPublica, talking to the soldiers down there. I mean, they're just making traffic stops, or they're guarding private ranches miles and miles from the border. I mean, there's nothing for them to do. It's, whether or not immigration is a problem and whether we should allow more legal immigration is a whole different issue. They're just sent down there as a show for political purposes. And once they're stuck there, they have to think of something to do with themselves, but they're not doing much of anything useful. And a lot of these National Guardsmen, of course, have jobs and families.
Right.
And they signed up for the National Guard in order to help out, say, after Hurricane Harvey or something like that. And they're feeling useless. And I heard on one of these podcasts, I don't know this directly, that there are certain educational benefits, which was an attraction for people to maintain some link to the military, that were cut last session. So there are these guys not even getting the benefits they had been promised, taken away from their jobs and families to think of something to keep themselves busy down at the border. It's just a horrible, horrible waste of money. And of course, once these things get locked in the budget, and they've been supplementing it by moving out of other agencies or out of funds the governor had available to him just to bulk it up. And it's probably going to stay bulk and just drain resources from much better investments until we see a change in who's in charge.
Yes, indeed. So, Dick, this process is ongoing, and you've laid that out well. We have been encouraging our listeners to meet with their representatives. Anything that you'd like to, any messaging you'd like to give them as they have those meetings with their both their elected representatives and the candidates for office?
Well, it is important. There are runoffs for a lot of legislative seats, and the runoff election is at the end of May. I'm sorry, I don't even remember the date. So there are candidates who are facing election soon. And then, of course, everybody's on the ballot in November because we had redistricting. Even senators who have longer terms, everybody's on the ballot this fall. And the message is that there's no excuse to not do the things we need to do. As we talked about, there is a lot of money available to the state of Texas. And instead of using it to reward businesses with property tax cuts, we should invest in our schools. We should invest in health and human services. I mean, the community assistants who help out folks who need help because they're in a wheelchair or whatever get paid nothing. It's an embarrassment. It would not cost that much to give these people who are vital to the health and safety of the people they're caring for, give them at least a livable wage. I mean, I wouldn't say it's basic morality, but it probably is. And you can go in, I mean, especially if you're representing a church group, you can talk in those terms about what we owe to each other and what we should be doing with this money. It's a matter of priorities. I just heard a clip from Joe Biden. I don't know how recently he said it, but he said, "Don't tell me your values, show me your budget." And that's what it's about.
Yes. Well, that is important. And the budget is, one of the most important things they're going to be talking about over the course of the legislative session. So let's make sure we're digging in now, having those conversations and setting the stage for the legislature coming in January. Dick, really appreciate the conversation. Any shameless plugs you'd like to leave us with today?
Well, just for Every Texan, we have a lot of information, not just about the budget and taxes, but about health care, both private insurance and Medicaid, about SNAP and other food and nutrition programs, about workforce development. We put out periodic reports on, I think we have one about Dallas County, about the welfare of children statewide also. It's at everytexan.org. We used to be known as the Center for Public Policy Priorities, CPPP. And actually, if you type in cppp.org, it'll take you to the right website. And it's not as many letters as Every Texan.
Dick, I'm not going to ask you on this podcast if you still do that because it'll probably get you in trouble at the office. But Every Texan. Also, I'll just plug Dick's a great follow on Twitter if you're interested in state budget, D. Lavine.
Wait, let me just say thank you for mentioning that. It's D. Lavine. It's Lavine. And yes, I tweet a lot about these issues and then randomly about other things.
Well, Dick, really appreciate the time. It's so good seeing you today. Thanks for the work you're doing on behalf of a better Texas every day.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. And thanks to everybody involved with Texas Impact.
I'm excited to welcome back to the conversation Texas Impact's Advocacy Director, Joshua Houston, for this week's weekly watch list. Josh, good to have you back.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
So I know we were very serious last week talking about foster care, and there's a lot to be concerned about in the world right now, but I feel like we have to start with the University of Texas women's basketball team because that's something we talk about often in our staff meetings. I know you were skeptical about the team a few months ago, but they just made a pretty impressive run to the Elite Eight. How are you feeling about that?
Yeah, I mean, they had an incredible season. And you're right, Scott. I mean, the news has been exceptionally serious lately. And we may have a slight reprieve this week from extremely serious new things, at least. There were some still very serious things lingering. But yeah, no, in the interim, you have to take periods to rest and recover and enjoy research and kind of reflect a little bit. So yeah, and then sometimes just watch some women's basketball with your daughter. So yeah, they had.
I just have to say, Rory Harmon, who is a superstar in the making, went to Cy Creek High School, which is where I went to school. So
no
double
kidding.
reason for me to root for UT.
Yeah, and she got Kendall Hunter with her too. Those two came out of school together, and Rory is my daughter's favorite player by far. He's my little 5-year-old is a big fan of Rory Harmon. That's her favorite player on the team. So yeah, they had a great season. I was a little skeptical. The coach is Coach Vic Schaefer he's a bit of an emotional guy. He's fun to watch on the sidelines. I'm just have a skepticism for emotional coaches because you have highs and lows, and the real question is, can you persevere through adversity? That was the part I was skeptical of a couple months ago, and boy, did they show me that they could. They persevered through some adversity in that Ohio State game, which was a real gut check. I mean, if you like physical defensive basketball, that was the game for you. It was a nerve-wracking game, and they absolutely proved that they were mentally tough and could persevere through it.
So, first of all, if anybody knows Rory Harmon, we'd love to have her on the program. So we'll figure out something she could talk about related to public policy, or just, have Josh's daughter come fangirl a little bit.
Yeah, we'd have to. Yeah, for sure. That'd be awesome.
So
don't know how to make that happen, but we should try to make that happen.
So, Josh, I am still in favor of us considering a weekly sports podcast, but we'll save that for another day. So, anything else that people should be watching this week besides UT women's basketball?
Well, I was just going to say, next season is going to be a good season to watch. They're going to lose 3 good seniors, but they have a very deep bench. And, of course, Rory Harmon is the number 1 outstanding freshman, but there's another outstanding freshman to watch, too. I mean, Aaliyah Moore had an incredible – she stepped up and
she
really developed as a player, and she had some double-doubles that were quite key to their success. And then they have a deep bench. They have Aaliyah Matharu, who is an incredible guard, and Deanna Gaston. They both play real tough, and they're real fun to watch if you like physical basketball. Should be a good season coming up.
It should be a good season coming up. We'll revisit this next March and see if we can't get that championship ring. But it is the interim, a little slower. This is usually the time, as you've mentioned in the past, where advocates have a chance to recharge and advocates can get organized for the next legislative session. Anything else we should be watching this week?
Yeah, and this is not unrelated to the upcoming March 24 runoffs. But one of the things I'm reading for, I don't know if this fun's the right word, but my idea of fun is different than most people's. My wife is like, my God, do you ever read for fun? I'm like, this is fun. But I'm reading a biography of Wayne Wheeler, who is probably the most powerful person in American politics you've never heard of. I think the latest biography of him was written in the 1930s. At least the one I'm reading is a very old biography that's out of print. So whenever people get cynical about money in politics, I tell them that money only matters and only prevails when voters aren't paying attention. I really push back on that narrative because it's very disempowering. People go, oh, there's money in politics, I can't do anything. Well, no, it only prevails if voters aren't paying attention. Because at the end of the day, we count the votes. That's why the right to vote is so fought over. People have been willing to be bloodied and die for the right to vote. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's votes that send the signal to the elected officials as to what the public wants them to do on policy.
Yes.
And Wayne Wheeler learned that. He learned a lesson from the robber barons and frankly did it even better than they did. There was an infamous robber baron named Jay Gould back in the late 19th century, and he once said, I'm a Democrat in a Democratic district, I'm a Republican in a Republican district, but I'm always for the Erie Railroad. And, of course, the point being he doesn't really care what party you are as long as you do his thing. And he would funnel money accordingly. And in some ways, our business communities in Texas has forgotten that lesson a little bit. Nevertheless, Wayne Wheeler was kind of he was kind of the generation after the robber barons. And he took that lesson and said, okay, you've actually got a weakness, robber barons. You don't have voters. You just have money. So Wayne Wheeler organized people, and then he convinced those people not to care what party someone was, but to vote in the primaries and only care, in this case, if somebody was wet or dry, which was the term. I mean, he was the prohibitionist, and that was his issue. And so they actively injected prohibition into the party primaries of both parties all over the nation. And there's no reason this can't be done again today. It could be done for LGBTQ equality. It could be done for voting rights, payday lending, whatever. It's called controlling the margins, to where you're trying to control with a block of voters the margin that an elected official needs for victory, whether it be a primary or a general. And in a state house race, for instance, and we'll talk about several of them coming up in the coming weeks, you only need 500 voters to just scare the absolute bejesus out of elected officials. Is 500 votes, because we're going to talk about there's a number of races every cycle. This cycle is no exception, where elected officials won by 100 votes or less. So if you have a block of 500 voters committed to one issue, you can't be ignored. And right now, the far right extreme wing of the Republican Party gets this lesson, is applying this lesson, and is winning Republican primaries. And that is driving the policy narrative in Texas. And most Texans have forgotten that they need to be participating in primaries. And that's evidenced by the fact that only 13% of the state votes in a primary. It's 8% in the Republican Party primary, and about half of that number, so 4%, in a primary runoff. So an elected official only needs to convince and talk to about 2.5% of the voting age population to effectively win and advance an agenda in Texas.
When you talk about blocks of 500, I think it's important for listeners to remember, like, you don't by yourself have to find 500 people to go vote with you. Like, number one, you pay attention and turnout because turnout is so low. And number two, like, find 5, find 10 to come with you and get some friends to try to do the same. So definitely watch
join
the primaries.
things.
Yep.
Yeah, you don't have to create your own thing. You just have to join things. Join your teacher union. Join your business organization. Join something like Texas Impact.
Well, important things to watch, Josh. May 24th, primary runoff elections coming up. We'll be talking more about it in the weeks to come. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you.
Joining us today for the response is Texas Impact's Executive Director, Bee Moorhead. Hey, Bee, how you feeling?
Hey, Scott, how are you? I'm doing good.
I'm doing well. I just had a chance to talk with Josh about women's basketball, so I feel like my day is now complete. But I think our listeners have probably had enough of that today. So why don't we jump in and ask you for your reflection on the conversation we just had with Dick Lavine. Obviously, Every Texan and Dick are wonderful partners in talking about the state budget. But what were your immediate reactions to that conversation?
Oh, man, so many. I enjoyed that conversation so much. And he is such a treasure, such a wealth of knowledge about the state budget and state revenue. And I just always feel like, even though I've known him for 30 years, that every time I get to hear him present, I learn more stuff. Today, I was particularly immediately interested in what he said about the constitutional amendments. I'm glad that he gave that good plain language description of those amendments. Constitutional amendments about taxes are always they're worded in really complicated ways, so it's really good for people to hear a plain language explanation. I also think there's a couple of equity issues that immediately step out for me. The first one being, so here are these two big tax-related constitutional amendments on a ballot that people aren't prepared for. It's out of sync with the rest of the constitutional amendments, which people voted on last fall. They're not really thinking about an election because they just had the big primary. So it's a little frustrating.
And a runoff soon thereafter, right?
And a runoff soon thereafter. That's exactly right. So it's just like a recipe for not getting very many people to vote, which is, frustrating from that standpoint. It's also, all of what he was talking about had to do with the basic concern that our tax system in this state is very regressive. We depend a lot on property taxes, and we make a lot of choices about our property taxes. We constantly find ourselves in the position, in kind of a locked-in position, one way or another, and every Texan and its predecessor, Center for Public Policy Priorities, Texas Impact, our colleagues at League of Women Voters, all of us have been saying forever, if Texas would do like a normal large state and have a state personal income tax, many of the people who these two constitutional amendments are aimed at wouldn't be paying property taxes at all, because we would have so restructured our tax system, or they wouldn't be paying those school property taxes. They would still be paying for fire and police and stuff. But
Right.
So I think there's a real frustration about the constant tweaking, and that it has to go into the Constitution every time we do it, and that it is all just a way of preventing the big conversation about what would be an actual sustainable, just way to fund the operations of our state. So it's a frustration.
Well, so speaking of funding the operations of our state, that budgeting process is starting to take place now. And I imagine if you were doing the Watchlist section, the thing you're watching for over the course of the next few weeks are those budget instructions. So talk to us some about, or respond to us some about what he talked about, the budgeting process and what you're watching for on the budget instructions.
Well, right. So, I mean, one thing, if you've been on the administrative council or the vestry or the session or the board or whatever your polity calls the governing body of your religious congregation, then you're familiar with this idea that the budget process starts way in advance of when we're actually going to do the voting on it. So,
Right.
it shouldn't be surprising to anybody that the state legislature would already be starting the process of making a budget that they will vote on, more than a year and change from now, and it won't go into effect until September of next year. That's a pretty normal, certainly as a United Methodist, you know,
Yes.
that's probably precipitous for a Methodist budget process. But so he mentioned some parts of the budget process, and that budget cycle document on Every Texan's website is great. The Legislative Budget Board is the state agency that does the budgeting for the state, and they have a really elaborate and multicolored budget cycle graphic that I like as well. But he talked about the budget instructions and he said, we're waiting for them to come out. We're waiting for them to come out this year. I'm going to bet you $1 that
no gambling.
They are okay. I'll bet you a cookie that they will be similar to the budget instructions that we've gotten every time for the past, more than 15 years, I think, where every single session, the opening bid is, what would you do with less? How can you, in a state where the population is exploding, where the economy is huge, the economic output is globally significant, we've had, all of the challenges that we've had, and this state is in such a position of responsibility in the United States and globally that we always start with, what would you do with less? That's just fundamentally the wrong question. How would you cut your budget by 5%?
Right.
How would you cut your budget by 10%? When we know, he brought up, we have a $25 billion surplus apparently. So why would you ever, and this isn't the first time that we've had a surplus and all this time, but every time is, what would you do with less? The question, as people of faith, we know this question, right? The question is, what's the world you want to see? What would you want to do? If you could have more, what would you do with it? What's the best way to serve our community? Does it mean, well, if you ask that question, you must mean you expect more money? No, it doesn't necessarily mean that. If you think you are on the edge of broke, you should say, if I weren't, what's the thing I would like to have happen? What do I aspire to? That's what helps you get out of the condition that you're in. In water planning, there's a term that they use that I've started to use in every single policy conversation, and I actually am now using it in a household context as well, which might make my family a little bit eye-rolly. But the term is desired future conditions, DFCs. What are the desired future conditions? What do you want it to be like? And then you work backward. If that's what you want it to be like, what would you do to get there? From Talanoa, right? Where are we? Where do we want to go? And how do we get there? We don't say, what do we have to do to be even cheaper? How can we do even less? But I think when we talk about desired future conditions, maybe that's a way to get at the paradigms that make somebody ask the question about, what would you do with less? Because your desired future conditions might be, I don't want every child to go to school. I don't want everybody to be safe in their neighborhood. I don't want food to be affordable for everyone. I don't want the water to be clean and the air to be clean. And therefore, I have desired future conditions, which are better for some people and not for others, better for some areas and not for others. And I'm going to make a policy plan, a policy map to get me to those desired future conditions. But you have to ask that question. What do you want it to be like in the future? And then if somebody says, well, here's what I want it to be like in the future, I want it to be worse for you and better for me. Well, then those budget instructions make a lot of sense, right? Those budget instructions are just what you would do to get there. But if they say, I want a land flowing with milk and honey where everybody sits under their own vine and fig tree, then you'd have to say, well, figuring out how you can constantly invest less is probably not going to get you your own vines and fig trees.
I'll return that cookie bet and suggest that our listeners don't want that first set of options you just laid out. Dick also talked about the constitutional spending limit. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that and how that will impact the budgeting process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes right along with some of the other things that I'm fussed about the budget. That, what Dick was describing was that it's become much more draconian, the constitutional limit on spending has. When he was talking about it, I kept thinking about the old saying, never name the well from which you wouldn't drink. I think the constitutional spending limit is a way of salting a field, poisoning a well, cutting off an option, right? Cutting off an option that you don't know you might need to have available so that when there's real suffering, you can say, oh, well, if only we hadn't already. When instead, in a time like the time we're in right now, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that, we should be looking for every option available and socking it away. We should be hoarding up options. We should be making lists of if one eventuality will do it this way, if another eventuality will do it the other way. Why do I say that? Why, Scott? Why do I say that?
I don't know. Why do you say that?
Climate change. Climate change is going to make new nonlinear circumstances the norm. It is going to be more and more that we are going to say, wow, I never thought that could happen. Right. We can't afford to be cutting off options that could help us with circumstances we can't imagine. You know the hymn that I love and you love that Martin Luther King also loved.
It's a pretty good list.
You, me, and Martin Luther King? Absolutely. The line is, new occasions teach new duties, right? Once to every man and nation, new occasions teach new duties. Time makes ancient good uncouth. We can't know what's going to happen, and climate change is making it be that we can't know in a pretty short window of time from episode to episode. Why would we make rules that make it harder for us to pivot, harder for us to maneuver just at the time when we need the most resilience and flexibility?
We've come a long way because the first legislative session I worked for you as an intern way back in the day, there was like a $10 billion budget shortfall. Yep. And now we're suggesting that there might be $25 billion extra dollars. How does the messaging differ? If you were meeting with your legislators or candidates now, how would you use that $25 billion number in those conversations?
I wish and I hope that everyone who hears this will say to their legislator exactly what I just said to you.
Right.
What do you want it to be like? What do you want it to be like? What do you want Texas to be like? What do you want Texas to be like in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 100 years, right? Knowing that we can't control everything and knowing that we won't always have buckets of extra money lying around, what do you want it to be like? And what do you think is the best investment of that $25 billion? So I think you and I can agree, and hopefully anybody who would ever hear this conversation can agree, that putting your money under your mattress doesn't constitute investment, right? That constitutes saving it, maybe saving it for a rainy day. Hoarding it comes to mind also. But it's not investing it. Investing it is when you put it to work so that it can make something even bigger and better later. So I would ask listeners, when you talk to a legislator, to focus on the idea of when we have the opportunity to invest in our state, what do you think the investment should be?
That sounds like a pretty good homework assignment. Bee, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I want to thank our guests today, Rabbi Neil Blumofe, Dick Lavine, Josh Houston, and Bee Moorhead. But I especially want to thank you for tuning in. To reiterate what I said at the top, there's a lot going on in the world right now, but the challenge is to focus on small things that we can do. And I would start by studying the candidates running for office and begin to build relationships with them. Start this week by learning about the budgeting process or another important issue to you, and schedule a meeting to introduce yourself and hear their thoughts. Your community and the world need Texans of faith to help bring voices of sanity to the political discourse. We have important content in this episode that I hope you'll share with your friends and congregations as we prepare to engage in the policy process this spring and summer. And with that, it's time to draw this episode to a close. If you've stayed with us this long, you must have enjoyed the content, so I hope you'll share it with your friends and congregations and leave us a rating or review. That way, even more of your friends can find us and join in the movement for justice in Texas. And there's a lot going on, so keep an eye on Texas Impact social media for upcoming announcements, or email me at scott@texasimpact.org with questions. And remember, if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members of Texas Impact by going to texasimpact.org. Friends, these are wild times, and 2022 is an important year for democracy, our communities, and the communities and families served by the Texas state budget. More than ever, the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnet, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is Bee Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.